Okay, I've started the recording. I am, let's see. Okay, you're Alex? Okay. You're Elizabeth. You're Charmaine? Okay. Okay. In case you're wondering, your exam, we had rescheduled it once because of the hurricane. It was rescheduled for Tuesday of next week. We're going to postpone that a little bit. On Thursday, I'll tell you exactly when it will be. It'll be either Thursday of next week or the following Tuesday. And it will cover chapter, I believe on the last exam, we didn't cover all of chapter 30. So most of chapter 30 will still be on this exam. Chapter 31 and definitely chapter 32. We're just doing a tiny bit in chapter 33, so we will probably go ahead and include that. That will be the main part of the third exam. Okay, any questions? Okay, one of the things that I try to emphasize and encourage you to do in this class is to focus on the details and encourage you to remember how important it is to get the details right. And sometimes it's good to give an example of how important it is and what happens when you don't get the details right. I'm giving an online exam that ended last night. It's supposed to end at 11:59 p.m. Somehow I set it to end at 5:30. And it's a class with 100 people, and about 30 of them planned to take it after 5:30 yesterday. So it's a tiny mistake, but once I found out about it, there was a huge problem for a lot of people. And it's easy to make that mistake, but that doesn't reduce the cost to the people involved, and it doesn't reduce the cost to me because I had a ton of emails that I had to respond to and figure out what to do about. So take it from my personal experience. You can know the details are important and still you forget to check them. I was really depending on my phone. I knew what great, thank you.
There's a class until, she said 10:45.
Yeah.
So from then, and then there's not another one in it till 2.
Okay, great.
So if you want to officially move, just shoot an email to Randall so we can do the paperwork.
Okay.
So they can do it for you.
Great, thank you, thank you. I knew the importance of details and I was trying to pay close attention, but still I missed one of those details and it created significant problems. Learn from my experience. Just got some good news from our secretary that the room 143 is available at 11 o'clock, your class time. So that means that on Thursday, we will be meeting in room 143, and anybody who wants to come can come. So we'll still be Zooming, and so if you are Zooming, you will still be counted as attending, but you will have the ability to come and be in a classroom that does not have a giant air conditioner that makes lots of noise. So I'm really looking forward to class on a Thursday. Okay, we are going to finish up chapter 31 pretty quickly and go into chapter 32. 31 is on inflation. We talked last time, I think one of the last things we talked about was the Fisher effect. This is named after an economist, Irving Fisher, and refers to the tendency of nominal interest rates to rise when expected inflation rates rise. This is the equation, or in words right here. The nominal interest rate, which is the interest rate stated in terms of money. The nominal interest rate is the interest rate that is quoted to you when you go to the bank to borrow money or to put money into your account. It's always going to be stated in nominal terms. And the idea is that the nominal rate will be the sum of the real interest rate, which is the interest rate, the return you're getting in terms of purchasing power, plus the expected inflation rate. And the idea is that when, remember what we said last time, that when there is unexpected inflation, that benefits the borrower, because the borrower gets to repay the loan with dollars that aren't worth as much. And once the lender comes to expect this, once he realizes there's going to be inflation, the lender doesn't want to be hurt. So he says, well, there's going to be inflation, so I want to be compensated for that. I want a higher interest rate. So as people start to expect higher inflation, the nominal interest rate goes up. And let's see, this is what we talked about last time, that when you have unintended inflation, unexpected inflation, remember who benefits and who loses. Lenders lose, borrowers benefit. And here we see from the 50s through 2010, how nominal interest rates do rise with expected inflation. Here we see as the inflation rate went up, people gradually learned to expect inflation. Okay? At first they didn't expect much, but as they learned to expect inflation, then nominal interest rates went up. You can see that. They track pretty closely. In the 80s, as actual inflation came down, eventually people started to expect less inflation. It's like, you know, if you had to guess what inflation would be next year, you'd probably think, well, it's probably going to be pretty close to what it was this year. So if it was 1.5 this year, you probably think it'd be 1.5 next year. So as inflation starts going up, people start to expect more inflation, and then interest rates go up with a lag. And when inflation comes down, people gradually start to expect less inflation, and interest rates gradually come down. That's a really, really important relationship. In recent years, inflation's been very low, but that does not mean it will stay low. It can go up. In fact, I would say that if current trends continue, with the government borrowing massive amounts of money and financing that by creating massive amounts of new money, at some point inflation will go up. Now, will that be in a year or will that be in 100 years? I don't know the answer to that question, okay? But eventually I think that it is likely to increase. Something to think about, this is a listing of the interest rate you could get if you invested in different treasury securities. When the government borrows money, they borrow by creating IOUs, called treasury securities, and they sell those to whoever wants to buy them. And if you buy treasury security, then you get interest on it. The rate of return you can get on these different treasury securities depends on the maturity of that security. You can get a security that's going to mature in 1 month. Okay? So you're lending money to the government for 1 month, or today, you're going to get your money back after 1 month. Or you can lend it for 30 years. You lend it today, you get your money back in 30 years. And the interest rate you get depends on which maturity you choose to invest in. And typically, short-term securities will offer only a very low interest rate, and longer-term securities will offer a much higher interest rate. But if you look at the green column here, you see that they are all offering very, very low interest rates. This is back in March, but they haven't changed very much. They've gone down a little bit, but pretty similar to what you have here, which means if you own the government money for 30 years by buying a 30-year Treasury security, you would lock yourself into an interest rate of 1.3% each year for the next 30 years. That's the nominal interest rate. And you want to remember the real interest rate is going to be the nominal rate minus the inflation rate. So if you invest in this 30-year Treasury security, you're going to get 1.3% interest. But if the interest rate, or if the inflation rate is 2%, that means year by year, the purchasing power of your wealth is going to get lower and lower. Even though you're getting more and more dollars, the purchasing power is going to get lower and lower. So that would indicate that you don't look at any of these Treasury securities and say, oh, wow, that looks really good. Okay? They all look bad. But the only question is there a better alternative for your money? And that's a more difficult question to answer. To recap some of the things we've said, when we have unanticipated or unexpected inflation, okay, actual inflation greater than expected, you want to remember lenders lose and borrowers benefit, because the borrowers are they're like my parents were in the 1960s and 70s and 80s. They had borrowed money, they were paying it back with dollars that had less purchasing power than the dollars they had gotten at the beginning. So my parents were benefiting. The savings and loan that loaned them the money went out of business. When we have the opposite, unexpected disinflation, which means that actual inflation is less than people expected, then the opposite occurs. Lenders benefit and borrowers lose. Because if you have less inflation than people expected, that means the lenders are going to get repaid with dollars that have more purchasing power than they were expecting to get. So that's great for the lender, but that's a cost to the borrower. And then if expected inflation and actual inflation are the same, which means if people's expectations were correct, then there's no redistribution. Okay? Borrowers aren't gaining, the lenders aren't gaining from inflation. Okay, we were going through 4 costs or problems caused by inflation. The first was that when you have inflation, the price system doesn't work as well. The second was what we just talked about, the redistribution of wealth. The third effect is that inflation interacts with other taxes. And this one is something most people would never see, but it can be very, very important. Well, let's say that you invest $10,000 in stock today. Okay? So you're buying that stock. 10 years from now, you sell that stock for $20,000. So you have doubled your money. That sounds good. But we know anytime you're looking at dollar amounts over time, what do you have to do? You have to adjust for inflation. Here I tell you that when you bought the stock, the CPI was 100. When you sell the stock, the CPI was 200. Prices doubled. You sold your stock for twice what you paid for it. So in purchasing power terms, how much of a return did you get? Zero. Your purchasing power stayed the same. Prices in general doubled. The value of your stock doubled. So in purchasing power terms, you did not get any real return. Whatever you could have bought with that $10,000 at the beginning, at the end, you can still buy that same amount, but now it's going to cost you $20,000. Okay? So you had, in our example here, you did not have a real return. This was not a good investment. You invest your funds for 10 years and you get no return. That's not a good investment. But what effect does this have on taxes? Okay. Let's say your marginal tax rate is 40%. Okay. Under the tax plan that Joe Biden is advocating, if you were a high income taxpayer, your tax rate on this gain, this is called a capital gain. When you buy something at one price and you sell it for a higher price, that's called a capital gain, and that is taxable. And under his plan, if you are a high income taxpayer, the effects are more extreme for them, so we're just going to focus on them. Your marginal tax rate would be 40%. Okay? So notice what's going to happen. In real terms, your rate of return was zero. Okay? Purchasing power terms, you're no better off than before. What about the tax you owe? Your tax is going to be 40% of your capital gain. Your capital gain is $10,000 because you paid $10,000 for something, you sold it for 20, so you have a $10,000 capital gain on this investment on which you had no real return. You are going to owe $4,000 in tax. Okay? So what's your after-tax rate of return? Well, in order to actually, my calculation here is not correct. This should be 16,000 over 20,000. It's one nice thing about PowerPoint. You can just fix it on the go. You started out with a certain amount of purchasing power. We've already said you end up with the same amount of purchasing power, but it's $20,000. But then you have to give $4,000 to the government. So you need $20,000 just to have the same purchasing power as before, but you end up with only $16,000, which means you end up with 80% of the purchasing power you had at the beginning, which means your after-tax return actually isn't minus 10%, it's minus 20%. Because of the unexpected inflation, you are being taxed even on an investment, even when you didn't have a real return. 20% of your purchasing power is going to go away. Right? If there hadn't been any inflation, then you wouldn't have had that capital gain. You wouldn't owe any tax. But the higher the inflation rate is, the greater the after-tax, the greater the tax-adjusted, the greater the inflation rate, the greater the effective tax rate is going to be. So inflation, in effect, increases the tax rate without the government having to propose and pass a tax increase. Now, I'm not going to ask you to be able to calculate this after-tax rate of return, but you do need to understand that the higher the inflation rate is, the greater the effective tax rate will be on investments. And if you tax investments more, you're going to get less investment. That means you're going to get less capital. It means you're not going to get as much economic growth. It means living standards won't be as high as they otherwise would be. Fourth complication of inflation is that inflation is painful to stop. We're not really going to go into that in this chapter. We'll talk about it more over in chapter, I believe, 35. But once the economy starts having inflation and people start to expect inflation, it's kind of like inflation is it's like a drug. It's like getting hooked on heroin. If you start taking heroin, you feel pretty good at first, or cocaine. You have a lot of energy, but that's not the long run effect. In the long run, it's going to hurt you, but your body gets adjusted to it. Very much like if the Fed is injecting lots of new money into the economy gets adjusted to it. It's not good for the economy, but we get adjusted to it. And just as somebody who's addicted to heroin, it would be wise for them to say, this wasn't really a good idea, I'm going to stop. When you have an economy that's hooked on high inflation, it's a good idea to say, this is a bad thing, we're going to stop doing it. Problem is that the heroin addict who stops using heroin doesn't immediately benefit. He goes into withdrawal and he suffers a lot. And the economy does pretty much the same thing. Inflation went up during the latter part of the 60s and the 70s. In around 1980, the Fed changed leadership and they said, inflation's bad, we're going to stop it. We're going to do whatever it takes. In fact, the chairman of the Fed, Paul Volcker, he said, inflation is like a dragon that is slaying the economy, burning it up, and we're going to stop it. And they did. But the economy went into a very severe recession and millions of people lost their jobs. So inflation is painful to stop. And people who remember what happened in the 80s think, we don't want inflation to get out of hand. People who don't remember that say, we don't have to worry if inflation goes up, it'll be okay. But if you look back at the 80s, there can be very, very high cost of letting inflation go up. Right now, people at the Fed are saying, we don't have to worry about inflation. If it goes up, we can worry about that later. Okay? We'll see how prudent that is. I'm sorry?
They don't have a large time horizon.
That would be one way to say it. I would say they're having a kind of short time horizon. If you have a longer time horizon, then you look at what's gonna happen eventually. It's a little more complicated than that. I wouldn't say they're being stupid. I mean, they've thought through a lot of things, but there can be problems of letting inflation go up, and we'll see those more later on.
So 2008 wasn't.
I'm sorry?
2008 wasn't inflation problem, that was a recession.
That's right. 2008 was a complicated. It was a financial crisis that led to a recession. The Fed took dramatic action, an action that a lot of people thought would lead to a big increase in inflation, and that didn't happen. Inflation stayed low. So the people at the Fed now, they can point to that and say, see, it didn't cause a problem then, so we can keep doing it. Maybe they'll be right. We'll see. We'll see. One thing I want to touch on very briefly is the idea of monetizing the debt. That simply means when the government pays off its debts by printing money. Okay? When the government spends money that it doesn't have the tax revenue to pay for, we've already said that it finances that spending by borrowing, by selling treasury securities. With monetization, basically the Federal Reserve purchases that debt. Okay? And the problem with monetizing the debt is that when they increase the money supply at a fast rate, that can cause high inflation. And when you have high inflation, who benefits from the high unexpected inflation? Borrowers. And who is the biggest borrower on the planet? the US federal government. So they're borrowing all this money, and at some point in the future, they can deal with that debt simply by getting the Federal Reserve to purchase it. And that will deal with the federal government's debt problem. But all the people who loan money to the government by buying Treasury securities are the lenders who are going to be hurt by unexpected inflation. That is the concern about monetization. I'm not saying that we're going to have high inflation. I'm saying it's a concern. And later on, we'll go into it in more depth. But it is important to recognize that monetization is a way that a government can deal with a high debt. Simply create money to pay off that debt. And when they do that, it benefits the government because they are the borrowers, and it hurts the lenders, who are in many cases retired people who have bought Treasury securities, put their retirement money into it because they didn't want to bear any risk, and they didn't think about the risk that the government would cause higher inflation and cause them to lose purchasing power. It's a complicated issue. We're just barely touching on it. We will get into it more in chapter 34 and 35. Oh, one other important thing. And I say this is really important. We said that lenders are hurt by unexpected inflation. And so, according to the Fisher effect, when lenders start to expect more inflation, what happens? They demand higher interest rates. And so if a point comes, we don't seem to be there yet, but if a point comes where people start to look at these massive government deficits and say, I don't know, I'm afraid that this is going to lead to higher inflation. If people start to think that, then the interest rates that the government pays on its debt could go up very substantially. And that would be a huge problem because they've now borrowed extra trillions of dollars, and the interest rate they're paying on it is close to zero. But if that were to go up to 3%, 5%, 10%, then that would make the government's debt problem much more severe. So I would say there's reason to be aware of that. At what point will people start to expect the high debt to cause higher inflation? That's something that nobody can answer. It may not happen for 40 years. It could happen tomorrow. I don't know when it will happen. I don't know anybody that I think knows the answer to that. Okay, government monetizes its debt by what? Raising interest rates, lowering interest rates, printing money to pay off the debt. Printing money to pay off the debt. That's not literally correct. The government generally doesn't just print money. One of the really interesting things we'll see in chapter 34 is that the government doesn't generally literally print money. They create money in a way that's much easier. All it takes is a computer, and they do that every day. So that'll be interesting when we get to it. Okay. End of chapter 31. Now we are ready for chapter 32. And chapter 32 is an important chapter. It is going to present us with a new framework for thinking about the economy. And it's similar to supply and demand. It's going to make use of a whole lot of things that pretty much everything we've developed so far. But it is significantly different in some important ways. And I would say that the material in the textbook that you find is very good, but it is rather complicated. And so I have gone through and tried to create a study guide that lays out the basics in a way that makes it manageable. The first time I looked at this textbook 7 years ago, I didn't adopt it because I looked at this chapter and I said, that's too complicated. But I think eventually I decided, no, it's manageable. And if you focus on the study guide that I will give you, which we'll be going through in this PowerPoint, I think it is manageable. I think when you understand it, it really is a very useful model, much more useful than the model that was presented in my old book. It was complicated too, but the end result wasn't nearly as useful as this one is going to be.
How old is this book?
This book, I believe the first edition came out in 2013, and this edition came out in 2017 or 18. There's a new edition that's coming out in the spring, but I'll probably be sticking with this book. I don't anticipate a lot of changes I'm sure a lot of the examples will change because of COVID. But I don't think other things will change very much. And this is, put a plug in for the book. I do think this is the best book out there. They really have, a lot of books have supplements that they have largely because their publisher said, you need a supplement. So they came up with some stuff. They came up with some videos that aren't very helpful. But this book is, the videos are well, I hope you believe by now that they're really excellent, and they are not something they added on just to make it look like you got more for it. The video, everything ties together. Chapter 32, business fluctuations, aggregate demand and supply. A lot of this, like I said, is going to build on what we've already done. Economic growth is not a smooth process. We see lots of fluctuations, even in normal times. We see lots of fluctuations. We see recessions, for example. Real GDP in the US has grown an average rate of 3.2% per year in the recent past, but usually it's not we don't grow at that average rate. We grow at a rate above that or below that. Notice growth fluctuated from -5 to over 8%. In the new edition, it will say growth fluctuated from -33% to over 8%, to over, I think, 24%. So you can't overstate the magnitude of what we've been through in terms of the economy over the last 9 months. Recessions are of special concern because they involve increases in unemployment, and unemployment is painful for lots and lots of people. Unemployment is inevitable, but it is painful. And so if we if there's things the government can do to minimize that, almost everybody would say, yeah, we ought to do that. Unfortunately, it's not obvious what the government can do to minimize it. Okay, business fluctuations is referred to fluctuations in the growth rate of real GDP around its trend growth rate. The trend is about 3.2%, but we fluctuate. And so the business cycle refers to those fluctuations. We've already talked about recession. It's the part of the cycle where the output is going down, unemployment is going up. Here shows you the quarterly growth rate over the last, 70 years. And obviously it bounces around a lot. And again, notice it goes down to -15. In the next edition of the book, it will have to go down, way down to here to -33%. So we are literally off the chart. In this chapter, we're interested in trying to understand, why does this happen? We don't want it to happen. We would like growth to be 3.2% every year. So why do we have these fluctuations? What causes those fluctuations? This chapter presents the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, which is a framework for trying to understand what causes these fluctuations. Here you can see this is unemployment over the same period. As we're having all those fluctuations in real GDP, unemployment was fluctuating. Okay? The model we're going to use is going to have three curves: aggregate demand, long run aggregate supply, short run aggregate supply. Okay? So basically three things you're going to need to understand. And we use it to try to understand how unexpected things, unexpected shocks can affect inflation and the rate of growth of real GDP. Now, this is where we're headed. This is what we want to understand. Okay? Anytime you look at a graph, look at it carefully, think about what all is there. Sometimes we look at a graph and it just, it's like you have a deer in the headlights moment. It's like shock, but you get past that. Okay? First thing you look at is what's on each axis. The horizontal axis is the real GDP growth rate. Okay? So that's not anything new. Okay? We know what real GDP is. This is just the rate at which real GDP is growing. Okay? On the vertical axis, we have the inflation rate, which is sometimes represented with the symbol pi. And inflation rate, always remember the inflation rate is just the percentage change in the price level, or the annual rates at which the price level is changing. So our axes are growth rate of real output, the growth rate of prices. Okay? And what we're going to be saying, asserting, is that how much inflation we have in a given year and what the growth rate of real GDP is will be determined by what we've called here aggregate demand, what we've called long run aggregate supply, and short run aggregate supply. Okay? Now, this doesn't really mean much to you until you know what are these curves, but this is the end results that we want to understand. And as we go through this, we're going to start with aggregate demand, explain what it is. Then we'll talk about long run aggregate supply, talk about what it is. We'll talk about what can shift each of those curves. And then we'll talk about the short run aggregate supply curve. One thing I maybe should point out is that economics has been around since Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations, 1776. Macroeconomics, the study of the macroeconomy, the study of GDP and business cycles and inflation, you really could say is much younger. In the 1930s, it's not an overstatement to say that the field of macroeconomics really changed radically. It had to do with the Depression, and it had to do with the publication of a book called The General Theory that we'll be talking about in just a little bit. So what you study in this course is very different from what you would have studied if you had taken economics in the 1930s or the 1940s. Okay? Actually, what you study today is a lot different than what you would have studied in the 1960s or even the 1970s. Macro has changed a lot. And I think your book does a good job of presenting macro in its most useful form. Micro has not changed all that much. Some people would say micro is real economics. And it hasn't changed. The foundational ideas really don't change very much. We improve on them and expand on them, but the micro principles, that's why we so often refer back to Adam Smith, because much of what he said, we can still look at it and say, you know, what he said was right, and he really said it better than anybody else. You know, nobody said it better than he did. Now, there's some of the things he said were not right, and we know that. And if he were alive today, we could point out some things to him, and he would definitely understand that he was wrong on those points. So he wasn't right about everything, but he was very clear on a lot of those micro points. Okay, so this is what we want to try to understand. You're going to see a whole bunch of graphs in this chapter. Just remember, they're all variations of this one graph. If you understand this graph, understand what can shift these curves, then you'll be okay. Don't get overwhelmed with all the different graphs. They're just different forms of this one graph. So we need to look at it one part at a time. Okay? The aggregate demand curve. What does it represent? Well, this is the first part of the handout. The earlier version of the handout may be up on Moodle. I can't remember, but I just revised it yesterday. So I'll put up this version. You'll have a 3-page document that will summarize, that will be exactly the things that you see here, but without the graphs. The basic ideas of aggregate demands. Well, anytime you see an arrow over a variable, such as here, don't get perplexed by that. It just means that the rate at which that variable is growing. So when you see M arrow, that's just the rate at which the money supply is growing. So is it growing at 5% a year or 10% a year? That's what it's referring to. The aggregate demand curve comes from what's called the equation of exchange. We talked about that in chapter 31. I don't know that I called it the equation of exchange, but that's what's often called. And what is very simple, M times B equals P times Y. The money supply times the velocity of money will equal the price level times real output. Okay? N times V represents basically total spending. Okay? It's how many dollars there are in the economy times the number of times each dollar is spent. So if you had $7 trillion of money, and if velocity was 3, then that would mean you'd have $21 trillion worth of spending each year to purchase output. Okay? But rather than use the original equation here, as you saw from the graph, we're interested in growth rates. How fast is GDP increasing? How fast are prices increasing? So we can take this original equation and express it in terms of growth rates. And I'm not going to go through the math of how you get from this equation to that equation, but just notice that even though this equation may look kind of weird, we're not used to seeing all these arrows. Notice it's pretty simple. It's only got 4 terms, and the only math involved is addition. So the equation of exchange in terms of growth rates is the growth rate of the money supply plus the growth rate of velocity will equal the growth rate of the price level, which is what? What do we call the growth rate of the price level? The inflation rate. Okay, so anytime you see P with an arrow, just remember that's inflation, plus the growth rate of real output. Okay, okay, so that equation is really important. Okay? We won't really be using the original form very much, but we will be using this, it's called the dynamic version of the equation of exchange, okay? Because it's telling us how these growth rates are all connected to each other. And this equation really gives us the equation for the demand, the aggregate demand curve. Okay? What is the aggregate demand curve? Well, it shows all combinations of inflation and real growth for a given rate of nominal spending growth. Okay? Let's say that again. All combinations of inflation and real growth for a given rate of nominal spending growth. That means it tells us all the different combinations of inflation and real growth that will give us a particular growth rate in spending. Okay? For example, let's see, here we've got 1 point on the aggregate demand curve. Well, at that point, you read down, the growth rate of real GDP is 0. Growth rate of inflation or of prices is 5%. So if you add 5% plus 0, you get 5%. Okay? That's 1 point on the aggregate demand curve that is based on an assumption that spending is going to grow at 5% per year. Look at this point. If we're here, then real output's going to grow at 3%. Prices are going to grow at 2%. So if you got 3% more real output being produced, and if prices are 2% higher, then the total increase in spending is going to be 5%. Notice if we're here, spending grows by 5%. If we're here, it grows by 5%. What if we're down here? Well, that would be 5% real growth, 0 inflation. So once again, that would represent 5% total spending growth. The aggregate demand curve is showing us all of these different inflation rate, real growth combinations that will give us 5% growth in total spending. And if you want an equation for the aggregate demand curve, okay, this would be it. Okay? We've taken our equation here, and we just solved for the inflation rate. Okay? So the inflation rate is going to be growth rate of money plus the growth rate of velocity, see that here, minus the growth rate of real GDP. And so we just basically isolated the inflation rate on one side of the equation. It's going to be the inflation rate we have will be the sum of 3 things. It's going to be the growth rate of money supply plus the growth rate of velocity minus the growth rate of real output. This is a very useful equation, because if we want to know how much inflation are we going to have, it's going to be the sum of these 3 things. Earlier, back in chapter 31, we said in a simple form of the quantity equation, we said, well, what if real output doesn't change? What if it's just constant? And what if velocity doesn't change? What if it's constant? Well, if that is the case, if velocity is constant, so that's 0, and real output is constant, so that growth rate is 0, then what's the inflation rate going to be? It's going to be just equal to the growth rate of the money supply. Okay? So here we're seeing something we said about inflation in the last chapter. If output and velocity are fixed, if they don't change, then any change in the money supply will be directly seen in the inflation rate.
Why is there a 1 in front of the line?
That's a good question. Why is there a 1 there in front of the Y? That 1 doesn't change anything. It doesn't need to be there. Okay? They put that 1 there because they wanted you to see that the form they have written this equation in is in the form of y. You think back to algebra, okay, your basic form from an equation, y equals b plus ax. Now, if you don't remember your algebra, don't worry about this. But the basic form for an equation from algebra is the y variable will equal some constant, whatever the y-intercept is, plus the slope times the x variable. The reason they put that as y here is they wanted you to see that the slope of the aggregate demand curve is going to be 1.
Slope is n.
I'm sorry?
Slope is n.
Oh, why is this? Well, the A is that's just in the general format. What they want you to see is that for the aggregate demand curve, the slope is 1, which means when you go, if real growth increases by 1%, the inflation rate is going to go down by 1%. There's a 1-for-1 trade-off. Okay? And you see that, going from here down to, say, there. Okay? If you go from here down to there, inflation is dropping by 5%. Real GDP growth is going up by 1%. So that's the equation for the aggregate demand curve. What is it showing you? It's showing you all of the inflation rate, growth rate combinations that will add up to some constant growth rate. Here we're kind of assuming that we know the rate at which spending is going to grow. Okay. Here, this aggregate demand is making an assumption that we believe or we know that spending is going to grow by 5%. Well, is that going to be due to higher prices, or is that going to be to growth in real GDP? The aggregate demand curve says, well, we don't know, but any of these combinations would give us 5% growth. Okay. The aggregate demand curve by itself isn't very helpful, okay, but it's just one part of this model that will give us some very useful conclusions. So that's aggregate demand. Review, it's supposed to be an arrow there. M arrow plus V arrow equals real growth, inflation plus nominal growth, inflation plus real growth. The answer is the last one. You add these two growth rates together, it is giving you the rate at which prices will increase plus the rate at which real output will increase.
But I thought P arrow was inflation.
I'm sorry?
I thought P arrow was inflation.
Well, that's supposed to be an arrow. Sometimes PowerPoint has trouble with the fonts and it didn't. So that's supposed to be, or I'm sorry, that's V arrow. So this would be C is P arrow plus YR arrow. That's what C is representing. Okay, next point on the study guide. What will shift aggregate demand? We've talked, again, remember, to really understand the model, you're going to have aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So we're just looking at one part of it right now. Okay? we've talked about what the curve represents. It's all the different combinations of inflation rate and real growth that will add up to the same growth rate of spending. What will shift the aggregate demand curve? Well, that will occur if the rate of growth of nominal spending changes. So in our previous example, this was the aggregate demand curve for if spending is going to grow at 5%. If something changes and we think that spending is now going to grow at 7%, then that means that the entire aggregate demand curve is going to shift out. And that means that every point on the new aggregate demand curve will give you an inflation rate and a real growth rate that would add up to 7 rather than 5. Now, what could cause that to happen? What could cause an increase in the growth rate of total spending? Or equivalently, what could cause aggregate demand to shift? 2 possible causes. First, a change in the growth rate of the money supply. Basically, if the Fed starts increasing the money supply faster or more slowly, that will shift aggregate demand. We'll see, we will see toward the end of this chapter that in the 1930s, the Fed caused the growth rate of the money supply to be negative. The money supply dropped by about 33%. And we can see one of the key causes of the Depression was that change in the growth rate of the money supply. That shifted aggregate demand, and that pushed us into a very severe depression. So one cause is a change in the growth rate of the money supply. The other change is in the growth rate of velocity. Keep in mind, remember we said the equation for aggregate demand is what we have here. Okay? And anytime this term changes or this one, okay? This is M arrow, this is V arrow. Either one of those change, that is going to shift the whole aggregate demand curve. Okay? So in a sense, we're saying only 2 possible causes of a change in aggregate demand. Change in the growth rate of the money supply or a change in velocity. But that's not really the whole story, because what can cause the growth rate of velocity to change? Well, there are actually a number of things that can cause that. Growth rate of velocity can change due to changes in the components of spending. And here we have to remember and think back to chapter 30. Remember our, no, not chapter 30, chapter 26, GDP. Remember the spending approach to GDP? It gave us that equation, real GDP equals C plus I plus G plus NX. Okay. Changes in velocity will occur if we have changes in these components of spending. Okay. Now, understanding exactly why that connection is there, I would say is a little hard to grasp. You just want to remember that what can cause aggregate demand to shift? A change in the growth rate of M or a change in the growth rate of velocity. What can cause velocity to change? A change in the growth rate of any of these spending components. So if consumers start to increase their spending faster, or they decrease their spending, that is going to change velocity. That's going to shift aggregate demand. If businesses decide to increase the growth rate of investment or decrease it, Change velocity, it's going to shift aggregate demand. If government increases the rate of growth in its spending or decreases it. Okay? Same for foreign sector spending. If any of these components of spending change in terms of the growth rate, velocity is going to change, aggregate demand is going to change, and we're going to see when aggregate demand changes, that has an impact on inflation, and it has an impact on the growth rate of real output. So all of these things are interconnected. And what we've done here is we've identified the things that can cause aggregate demand to change. And you can see it here. We start out with this initial aggregate demand curve based on spending growth of 5%. We're saying if something happens that causes spending to increase faster, then the whole curve is going to shift to the right. And what could cause that? Could be a change in growth rate of M or C or I or G. All of those things will lead to a shift of the aggregate demand curve. Okay? And all we're trying to understand now is what is the aggregate demand curve? What will cause it to shift? Events, particular events, which could change the growth rate of the spending components. Changes in consumer confidence. If consumers read the paper yesterday, I think it was yesterday, and they see that it's announced that there's a virus, a vaccine that has been tested and the results look very promising, and people start to think, oh, everything's going to be okay, my job's going to be secure, I'm going to have more income. Consumers feel more confident. What are consumers going to do? They're going to start buying more. They're going to spend more. Growth rate of consumption spending is going to go up. That causes velocity to go up, causes aggregate demand to shift to the right. Same thing for businesses. If businesses start to think, oh, well, maybe the worst is past, things are going to be better, the economy is going to be growing, people are going to be spending, it's going to be profitable to produce output. We better build a new factory. We better build new retail outlets. Okay? That means that because they are more optimistic about the future, they're going to invest more. And if the rate of growth in investment spending goes up, the rate of growth of velocity goes up, aggregate demand increases, it's going to have an impact on the rest of the economy. Taxes also. Taxes affect consumer spending and business spending, okay, in lots of complicated ways, but the general tendency is pretty simple. You raise taxes, spending is going to be reduced. If it's taxes on consumers, then higher taxes mean you don't have as much disposable income, so you can't spend as much. For businesses, higher taxes mean investment spending isn't as profitable, so they tend to cut back on investment. Level of government spending, that's pretty self-explanatory. If the government decides to spend more, growth rate of G goes up, velocity goes up, aggregate demand increases. Economic conditions in other countries are also very important because we buy stuff from them and they buy stuff from us. If the rest of the world goes into a depression and their incomes go down, they can't afford to buy as much from us. So our exports to them are going to go down. That's going to decrease aggregate demand. It is a global economy. And when other countries are having problems, that generally is going to mean we're going to have some problems as well. We have an incentive to want others to do well, because if they're doing well, then they're going to be able to afford to buy output that we want to produce. And also just consumers' taste for imports. If we decide we want more imports or we want less, that's going to shift aggregate demand. Important thing to note here, when you have a change in the growth rate of velocity, that will tend to be temporary. And the reason for that may be a little bit hard to see. But let's say that you've got, pick one family. Let's say they're spending 80% of their income one particular period. And they decide now they're going to spend 90%. Okay? Well, then during that transition period, their growth rate of consumption spending goes way up. Okay? But after we get adjusted to the new higher level, the growth rate of consumption spending is going to go back down. Okay? Obviously, if they're spending all of their income, then consumption spending can't grow any further. Okay? So when we're talking about growth rates of spending can't be sustained forever. Okay? You can increase your growth rate of spending, but it cannot be sustained forever. So all of these changes we've been looking at that can cause velocity to change, all of them will tend to be temporary, which means when they occur, the aggregate demand curve, so if consumers are, let's say everybody's worried about, let's go back to March, when things start happening and people's expectations start happening, people get worried about the future. Businesses cut back on investment, consumers cut back on consumption spending. That would lead to a decrease in the growth of velocity. That would shift aggregate demand to the left, okay? But they don't continue to cut back on their consumption in further periods. It tends to be a decrease in the growth rate, but then it will go back up to its original level. So the effect on the economy would be that when they cut back on the growth rate of consumption, aggregate demand decreases. We'll see that's going to push the economy toward recession, but it will tend to go back to its original point. And that would indicate that this is a little more complicated to see, but we'll get into it more later. When our demand goes back, then it certainly looks like we can end up going back to our original equilibrium. Okay? It gets complicated, but the important thing there is that changes in velocity tend to be temporary, which means a shift in aggregate demand associated with a change in velocity will tend to be temporary. If it's shifting to the left, then eventually it's likely to reverse itself and to go back to where it was before. All right, that's aggregate demand. Long run aggregate supply. And all the figures here are referring to figures in your books. I really encourage you to use this study guide in conjunction with your textbook because the graphs are there. Okay. 35 is pretty much this. Notice this is still the aggregate demand, aggregate supply framework. So we still have real GDP growth rate on the horizontal, inflation rate on the vertical, nothing different there. Okay. But now that we're talking about aggregate supply, we're not talking about how much people will want to buy. We're talking about how much producers will be willing and able to produce and sell. Okay? And you can see that the long run aggregate supply curve we're asserting is upward sloping. Okay? What does that upward slope tell you about the relationship between those, or I'm sorry, what does the vertical slope tell you about the relationship between these two variables? They're not related. Okay? It tells you that if we're here with low inflation and we're at this growth rate, and then inflation goes way up, in the long run, the growth rate of output is going to be unaffected. In the long run, inflation does not have an effect on real growth. Notice it's called the solo growth rate. Don't let that word throw you. That if you remember back to chapter 28, when we presented the production model there, that was called the solo growth model. So when you see solo growth rate, that's the same as saying the long run growth rate or the rate of growth of potential GDP. Okay? It's just the rate at which we think the economy is going to grow over time. Basic ideas. The long run aggregate supply curve shows the economy's potential growth rates, okay, as determined by the real factors of production. Okay? Real means as opposed to financial. Okay? It's not how much people want to buy. Determined by real factors means how much are we able to produce, and that depends on, again going back to chapter 28, how much physical capital do we have? How many factories? How many machines, tools? How much human capital do we have? What is the size of our labor force? The technology, the ideas that we have. Those are all the things that have an impact on how fast the economy is going to grow. Okay? This is the supply side. Aggregate demand was all about how much do people want to buy. But supply has nothing to do with how much they want to buy. It's how much are producers able to produce. There's no relationship between inflation and the economy's ability to grow in the long run. Causing inflation does not enable us to produce more output in the long run. And that translates into a vertical long run aggregate supply curve, which is, we say that by saying that money is neutral in the long run. That means simply increasing the money supply doesn't enable us to produce more output in the long run. In the short run, we'll see that's a little more complicated. But in the long run, more money does not mean we can produce more output. What do we mean by the long run? They have a really good definition for the long run. We mean a period that is long enough that full price adjustment has occurred. Throughout this whole course, we've seen when you have a change in something in the economy, prices will adjust. How long does it take for that adjustment to occur? Okay? We haven't been real precise about that. When we talk about the long run, we're simply meaning a period that's long enough for prices to fully adjust. And that does not necessarily mean a long time. Okay? It's a period that is long enough for those full adjustments to occur. Okay? The economy's potential growth rate is called the solo growth rate. That's just terminology. All right, we're out of time. We will start next time with shifts in the long run aggregate supply curve. I will put up this afternoon the study guide that this outline is coming from. So you'll have in one place all of these key ideas. Because it's, like I said, it's a complicated chapter, but if you can focus on the importance, the really important stuff, not get lost in the details, it's really not that hard to make sense of. Okay? Any questions? All right, I will see you in room 143 on Thursday, unless something changes. If something changes, I will send you an email. But my expectation is that that we will be meeting in room 143. We'll say goodbye to this room.